Today you're going to learn about the story of Eleanor Hayes, a brave young woman who found herself involved in a desperate deal between her uncle, the mayor of a town in crisis, and a powerful rancher. A story of sacrifice, unexpected love, and the fight for survival in the heart of the American Old West. Before we start this incredible story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're listening to this story from. The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Clearwater Springs, a small frontier town nestled in the heart of Texas in the summer of 1873. What had once been a thriving settlement, built around a reliable spring that gave the town its name, now faced its darkest hour. The spring had been drying up for months, reduced to a mere trickle that could barely sustain a handful of families, let alone the 300 souls who called this place home. Mayor Thomas Garrett stood at his office window, watching as another wagon loaded with belongings rolled past, carrying the Henderson family toward the Eastern Territories. That made it the fifth family to abandon Clearwater Springs this month. His weathered hands gripped the windowsill as he contemplated the impossible situation before him. At 52 years old, Thomas had seen his share of hardships during his years as a frontier leader. He had survived Apache raids that left buildings burning and lives shattered, their smoke-filled nights haunted by the cries of the wounded and the weeping of widows. He had weathered economic downturns that forced families to stretch every penny until it screamed, watching proud men reduced to begging for work and women selling their most precious possessions to buy flour for their children. He had navigated political disputes that threatened to tear the community apart at its very foundation, mediating between opposing factions who seemed determined to destroy everything they had built together. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this crisis that threatened to turn his beloved town into another ghost settlement scattered across the unforgiving landscape of the American frontier. The sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs outside his office drew his attention away from his brooding contemplation. Eleanor Hayes, his 23-year-old niece, appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with what passed for their meager lunch. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun that spoke of function over fashion, and her simple blue dress, though well-mended and carefully maintained, spoke of better times when such concerns as matching ribbons and fine lace were luxuries they could afford without guilt or hesitation. Eleanor had come to live with her uncle 2 years earlier after her parents died in a cholera outbreak that swept through their hometown in Missouri like a merciless scythe, cutting down the young and old with equal brutality, leaving behind a trail of broken families and abandoned dreams. She had adapted to frontier life with remarkable resilience that impressed even the most hardened settlers, helping Thomas manage both the town's affairs and his modest household, with a competence that belied her relatively sheltered upbringing in the more civilized regions of Missouri. "Uncle Thomas, you need to eat something," Eleanor said, setting the tray on his desk with the gentle firmness that had become characteristic of her interactions with her increasingly stubborn uncle. "Worrying yourself sick won't bring rain or restore our spring, and it certainly won't help you think clearly about solutions to problems that require clear thinking and careful planning." Thomas turned from the window, his face etched with the weight of responsibility that seemed to grow heavier each day, creating new lines around his eyes and adding silver to his once brown hair with alarming rapidity. "Eleanor, my dear, I fear we're beyond the point where rain alone can save us. Even if the heavens opened today and poured down the kind of torrential downpour that turns dry creek beds into raging rivers and transforms the desert landscape into temporary lakes, it would take months for our spring to recover to its former strength, and we don't have months. We have weeks, perhaps days, before the last of our carefully rationed water reserves run out completely, leaving us with nothing but dust and memories." Eleanor studied her uncle's face with the careful attention she had learned to apply to reading the moods and concerns of the townspeople, who frequently sought his counsel in these desperate times. She had watched him age years in the span of months as the crisis deepened and intensified with each passing day, each new departure, each failed attempt to find alternative solutions. The proud man who had helped found this town with his own hands, who had fought off Apache raids with rifle and determination, who had weathered land disputes and territorial politics with equal skill and patience, now faced an enemy he couldn't shoot or negotiate with using traditional frontier methods. "There must be something we can do," Eleanor said, settling into the chair across from his desk with the determined posture that reminded him so much of her late mother, who had possessed the same stubborn refusal to accept defeat, even in the face of overwhelming odds. "What about the territorial government? Surely they have resources available for situations like this. Emergency provisions, alternative water sources, some kind of assistance program for struggling settlements that have proven their commitment to development and civilization. Thomas let out a bitter laugh that held no humor whatsoever, the sound echoing hollowly in the small office. I've sent 3 letters to Austin, each more desperate than the last, explaining our situation in increasingly stark terms, begging for any kind of assistance or guidance they might be able to provide. Their response was a form letter expressing sympathy and suggesting we relocate to established settlements where water access is more reliable and the infrastructure already exists to support growing populations. They see us as expendable, Eleanor. Just another failed experiment in Western expansion, another casualty of manifest destiny that didn't quite manifest the way the politicians and land speculators promised it would when they drew their maps and made their grand speeches about taming the wilderness. As if summoned by their conversation about desperate measures and official indifference, heavy footsteps echoed on the stairs again, this time with the measured cadence that spoke of law enforcement authority and official business. Deputy Marshal Jake Morrison appeared in the doorway, a lean man in his 30s whose badge carried the weight of federal law, and whose expression suggested he brought news that would complicate their already desperate situation even further. His face was grim as he removed his hat and stepped into the office with the careful movements of a man who had learned to be cautious about delivering bad news to people who were already stretched to their breaking point. Mayor Garrett, Miss Hayes, Jake nodded respectfully, his voice carrying the formal tone he adopted when delivering official communications from the territorial authorities. I'm afraid I bring news from the territorial capital that might complicate your situation further, if such a thing is even possible at this point in your struggle. Thomas gestured for the marshal to take a seat, steeling himself for whatever additional burden was about to be placed on his already overwhelmed shoulders. I can't imagine how our situation could become more complicated, Jake, but please share what you know. We're beyond the point where bad news can make things significantly worse than they already are. Jake cleared his throat uncomfortably, shifting in his chair like a man who wished he could be anywhere else in the world, delivering any other kind of message to any other people. I've received word from the territorial authorities about the official status of Clearwater Springs. Given the population decline and the ongoing water crisis, they're actively considering revoking the town's charter within the next 30 days. If that happens, this land reverts to open territory, available for homesteading or purchase by anyone with the means and inclination to develop it, according to territorial guidelines and federal land use policies. Eleanor felt her heart sink into her stomach like a stone dropped into a deep well, the sensation of falling that seemed to go on forever. She had grown to love this harsh but beautiful country with its endless skies and rugged independence, and the thought of losing their home felt like losing her parents all over again, like having her heart torn from her chest twice in the span of 3 years. Thomas rose and walked to a map hanging on the wall, pointing to a vast area marked in red ink with careful precision. Blackwater Ranch, 50,000 acres controlled by Lucas Blackwater, including the only reliable water source within 100 miles of here. His ranch sits on an underground river that never runs dry, fed by mountain snowmelt from the north and protected by natural rock formations that prevent evaporation. Eleanor studied the map, beginning to understand the implications of her uncle's words and the direction his thoughts were taking. You're thinking of asking him for water rights? I've already approached him twice, Thomas admitted, his voice heavy with the memory of those humiliating encounters. Both times he's refused outright without even considering the humanitarian aspects of our situation. Lucas Blackwater is a complicated man, Eleanor. He came to Texas 5 years ago with money from back east, bought up land that nobody else wanted because it seemed worthless at the time, and built an empire through shrewd business practices and ruthless determination. He's not unkind, exactly, but he's extremely protective of his resources and deeply suspicious of townspeople and their motives. He sees settlements like ours as temporary inconveniences that will eventually disappear, leaving him with more land to expand his operations. But surely if he understood the full situation, if he saw that people are actually dying from thirst and desperation, Eleanor began, her voice trailing off as she recognized the futility in her uncle's expression. Thomas turned from the map with an expression that made Eleanor's blood run cold, a look that spoke of options so desperate that even considering them seemed like a betrayal of everything they held dear. He does understand, Eleanor, and he's made it abundantly clear that he has no interest in extending charity to Clearwater Springs or any other settlement in the territory. However, he paused, seeming to struggle with words that felt like poison in his mouth. He has suggested an alternative arrangement that would benefit both parties involved. Eleanor rose from her chair, sensing that whatever her uncle was about to say would change everything between them and alter the course of their lives forever. What kind of arrangement could possibly interest a man like that? Lucas Blackwater is a wealthy man, but he's also profoundly isolated by choice and circumstance. He's built a successful ranch, accumulated more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, but he lives alone in that vast house with only his ranch hands for company. He's expressed interest in finding a suitable wife, someone educated and refined but also strong enough for frontier life, someone who could bring dignity and culture to his household while understanding the harsh realities of Western existence. The words hung in the air between them like a loaded gun, dangerous and explosive. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as she understood exactly what her uncle was suggesting, the full horrifying implications of this desperate proposal. "You want to arrange a marriage between me and this stranger in exchange for water rights," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil churning in her chest like a storm-tossed sea. "You want to trade me like a commodity to save the town." Thomas couldn't meet her eyes as the weight of his words settled between them like a physical barrier. "Eleanor, I would never ask this of you under normal circumstances, but we're not facing normal circumstances. If we can secure access to Blackwater's water, we can save this town. 300 people, Eleanor. Families who have nowhere else to go, who have invested everything they have in making a life here." Eleanor walked to the window, looking out at the dusty street where children played despite the dire circumstances, where women tended gardens that struggled in the drought, where men worked to maintain hope in the face of impossible odds. These people had become her community, her family in a way that went beyond blood. The weight of their survival pressing down on her shoulders felt heavier than the oppressive Texas heat. "What exactly has Mr. Blackwater proposed?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled, though her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the windowsill. "A formal marriage contract. In exchange for your hand, he would grant the town permanent water rights, enough to sustain our current population and allow for modest growth. The agreement would include provisions for a substantial dowry to help fund town improvements and establish a reserve fund for future emergencies." Thomas's voice grew quieter with each word, as if speaking them aloud made the proposal more real and therefore more terrible. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible choice settling on her shoulders. "And if I refuse, then we evacuate the town within the month. The people scatter to wherever they can find shelter, and Clearwater Springs becomes another cautionary tale of failed Western expansion, another ghost town with empty buildings and broken dreams." The silence stretched between them as Eleanor grappled with the magnitude of what was being asked of her. She thought of the children she had helped teach in the town's makeshift school, their eager faces as they learned to read and write. She thought of the elderly couples who had staked their final hopes on this frontier community, spending their life savings on land and dreams of prosperity. She thought of the young families who had traveled thousands of miles to build new lives in the American West, only to face this cruel twist of fate. "Tell me about him," she said finally, turning from the window to face her uncle. "This Lucas Blackwater. What kind of man am I being asked to marry?" Thomas walked to his desk and pulled out a folder containing correspondence and notes he had gathered during his dealings with the rancher. "Lucas is 35 years old, unmarried, and by all accounts a man of his word. He came to Texas from Boston 5 years ago, with substantial capital from his family's shipping business. His father had died, leaving him with both money and a desire to escape the confines of Eastern society." "Why Texas? Why ranching?" Eleanor asked, settling back into her chair with the resignation of someone preparing to hear her fate decided. "From what I understand, he had some kind of falling out with his family's business partners. Something about ethical disagreements over their shipping practices, though he's never spoken of it directly. He came west looking for a fresh start and found his calling in cattle ranching. He's built one of the most successful operations in the territory, employing over 50 men and maintaining herds that number in the thousands." Eleanor absorbed this information, trying to form a picture of the man who held her town's fate in his hands. "What is he like personally? His character, his temperament?" Thomas consulted his notes, though Eleanor suspected much of what he was about to share came from careful observation during their previous meetings. "He's intelligent, well-educated, and speaks several languages. His ranch hands respect him, which suggests he's fair in his dealings with employees. He pays better wages than most ranchers in the territory, and has never had trouble keeping good men in his employ. But," Eleanor sensed there was more to the story, "but he's also incredibly private and somewhat intense. He doesn't socialize with other ranchers or attend territorial social functions. He's built his ranch into a completely self-sufficient operation, as if he's trying to create his own world separate from the rest of civilization. Some say he's eccentric, others call him a hermit with money. Eleanor stood and began pacing the small office, her mind racing through the implications of what she was learning. Has he ever been married before? Any romantic entanglements that might explain his current situation? Not that anyone knows of. He arrived in Texas alone and has remained alone ever since. The closest thing to a personal relationship anyone has observed is his friendship with his foreman, Miguel Santos, a Mexican vaquero who's been with him since the beginning. Thomas paused, watching his niece's face carefully. Eleanor, I need you to understand that this isn't just about you making a sacrifice. Blackwater specifically requested that any potential wife be educated, refined, and capable of intelligent conversation. He's not looking for a servant or a convenience. He wants a true partner. A partner he's never met, Eleanor said dryly. How romantic. I know how this sounds, my dear, but arranged marriages aren't uncommon on the frontier, and many of them develop into genuine partnerships over time. At least you would be entering this arrangement with certain protections and guarantees. Eleanor stopped pacing and fixed her uncle with a direct stare. What kind of protections? Thomas opened the folder again and withdrew a document written in careful legal language. Blackwater has proposed a detailed marriage contract that would protect your interests and ensure your comfort. You would have your own quarters within the main house, a substantial monthly allowance for personal expenses, the right to travel to town or other locations with appropriate escort, and the guarantee that the marriage could be annulled after 1 year if both parties agree it's not working. An escape clause, Eleanor murmured, taking the document from her uncle's hands and scanning its contents. The legal language was dense, but the terms seemed surprisingly fair and considerate. This is more generous than I expected. Blackwater may be a recluse, but he's also a gentleman by birth and education. I believe he genuinely wants this arrangement to succeed for both parties involved. Thomas watched as Eleanor continued reading. There's something else, Eleanor. Something that might influence your decision. Eleanor looked up from the contract. What else could there possibly be? Yesterday morning, I received word from Dr. Patterson that Martha Williams is in critical condition. Her youngest son has been sick for weeks and she's been giving him most of her water ration. She's now suffering from severe dehydration and fever. If we can't get access to more water within the next few days, Thomas's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. The document in Eleanor's hand suddenly felt heavier. Martha Williams was a widow with 3 young children who had become one of Eleanor's closest friends in Clearwater Springs. The thought of her suffering while Eleanor deliberated over her own comfort felt like a physical blow. How long do I have to decide? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Blackwater wants an answer within 48 hours. If you agree, the wedding would take place within a week and the water rights transfer would be immediate. Thomas approached his niece and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Eleanor, I know this is an impossible situation. I know I'm asking you to sacrifice your own happiness and freedom for the sake of people who aren't even your blood relations. If you say no, I'll understand completely, and I'll never blame you for the consequences. Eleanor looked once more out the window at the town that had become her home. A dust devil spun lazily down the main street, picking up debris and scattered leaves from plants that had long since given up their struggle against the drought. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from the chimney of the doctor's house, where Martha Williams lay fighting for her life. I need to see him, Eleanor said suddenly, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Before I make any decision, I need to meet Lucas Blackwater face to face. I need to look into his eyes and see what kind of man I'm being asked to spend my life with. Thomas nodded slowly. I can arrange that. I'll send word to Blackwater Ranch requesting a meeting. But Eleanor, remember that first impressions can be deceiving, especially when both parties are under such unusual circumstances. Maybe so, Eleanor replied, folding the marriage contract carefully and handing it back to her uncle. But if I'm going to stake my entire future on this arrangement, I want to do it with my eyes wide open. I want to know exactly what I'm agreeing to, and I want him to know exactly what he's getting in return. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the struggling town of Clearwater Springs, Eleanor Hayes prepared to meet the man who might hold both her future and her community's salvation in his hands. The weight of responsibility had never felt heavier, but neither had her determination to face whatever lay ahead with courage and dignity. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew both uncle and niece to the window. where they watched a lone rider approaching through the shimmering heat. Even from a distance, there was something commanding about the figure on horseback, something that suggested this might be their first glimpse of the mysterious rancher, who had inadvertently become the center of their desperate hopes. The rider approaching through the dusty heat of the afternoon was indeed Lucas Blackwater, though he arrived earlier than Thomas had expected. The rancher sat tall in his saddle, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the burning sky as he guided his black stallion down the main street of Clearwater Springs, with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to commanding both animals and situations. Even from their vantage point at the office window, Eleanor could see that this was no ordinary frontier rancher. Lucas Blackwater dismounted with fluid grace, his movements economical and purposeful as he secured his horse's reins to the hitching post outside the mayor's office. He stood just over 6 feet tall, with dark hair that showed traces of premature silver at the temples and a face that spoke of both education and hard living. His clothes were well made, but practical. A white cotton shirt open at the collar, dark trousers, and boots that had clearly seen extensive use but were meticulously maintained. Everything about his appearance suggested a man who understood quality but had no use for ostentation. "Well," Thomas said quietly, straightening his vest and reaching for his coat, "it appears Mr. Blackwater is eager to move this matter forward. Are you ready for this, Eleanor?" Eleanor smoothed her dress and checked her reflection in the small mirror hanging near the door, trying to calm the nervous flutter in her stomach. "I suppose I'm as ready as anyone can be for a conversation that might determine the rest of their life." The sound of boot heels on the wooden stairs announced Blackwater's approach, each step measured and deliberate. When he appeared in the doorway, Eleanor felt her breath catch slightly. The man before her was undeniably handsome, but it was his eyes that held her attention, dark brown, intelligent, and surprisingly kind, despite the serious expression he wore. There was something about his presence that filled the small office, not through arrogance or bluster, but through a quiet intensity that suggested depths of character not immediately visible on the surface. "Mr. Blackwater," Thomas said, rising from his chair and extending his hand. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I'd like you to meet my niece, Eleanor Hayes." Lucas stepped forward and offered Eleanor a slight bow, his manners reflecting his Eastern upbringing. "Miss Hayes, I'm honored to make your acquaintance, though I regret the circumstances that have brought us together." His voice was deep and cultured, with just a trace of a Boston accent that hadn't quite been erased by 5 years of Texas living. Eleanor found herself studying his face as he spoke, noting the lines around his eyes that suggested a man who spent considerable time outdoors, and the firm set of his jaw that indicated someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. "Mr. Blackwater," Eleanor replied, offering her hand with what she hoped was appropriate dignity. "I understand you have a proposition that might benefit both my uncle's town and your own domestic situation." Lucas's eyebrows rose slightly at her directness, and Eleanor thought she detected the ghost of a smile at the corners of his mouth. "I appreciate a woman who speaks plainly, Miss Hayes. Yes, I believe we might be able to help each other, though I wanted to meet you in person before finalizing any arrangements. May I?" He gestured toward the chair facing Eleanor's. As Lucas settled into the chair, Eleanor found herself appreciating the way he moved, with the controlled power of someone who was completely comfortable in his own skin. She had expected a rough frontier rancher, perhaps crude in manner and coarse in speech. Instead, she found herself facing a man who clearly possessed both education and natural grace. "Before we discuss any practical arrangements," Lucas said, his gaze direct but not uncomfortable, "I want you to understand my position completely. I'm not looking for a wife out of loneliness or romantic desperation. I'm looking for a partner who can help me build something lasting on the frontier, someone who understands that marriage in this territory is often more about mutual support and shared goals than about passion or romantic love." Eleanor felt herself bristling slightly at his matter-of-fact tone. "And what makes you think I would be suitable for such an arrangement? You know nothing about me beyond the fact that my uncle is desperate enough to offer me as payment for water rights." Lucas leaned back in his chair, clearly not offended by her sharp response. If anything, he seemed pleased by her spirit. "On the contrary, Miss Hayes, I know quite a bit about you. I know you've been managing your uncle's household and helping with town business for 2 years. I know you've been teaching the children in Clearwater Springs despite having no formal obligation to do so. I know you've been organizing relief efforts for families in crisis, and that you've maintained your dignity and composure despite facing your own significant losses." Eleanor stared at him in surprise. "You've been investigating me?" "I've been observing," Lucas corrected gently. "When Mayor Garrett first approached me about water rights, I became curious about the town and its people. It's my business to understand my neighbors, even if I choose not to socialize with them extensively. What I observed was a young woman who had adapted to frontier life with remarkable grace while maintaining the refinements of her education. "And that qualifies me to be your wife?" Eleanor asked, her tone challenging. "That qualifies you to be someone I could respect and work alongside," Lucas replied without hesitation. "Marriage on the frontier requires partnership above all else. I need someone who won't wilt under pressure, who can think clearly in a crisis, and who understands that building something meaningful requires sacrifice and commitment." Thomas cleared his throat softly, reminding them both of his presence. "Perhaps you'd like to discuss the practical aspects of the arrangement?" Lucas nodded but kept his eyes on Eleanor. "The terms I've proposed are generous but also practical. You would have considerable freedom within the marriage, Miss Hayes. I'm not looking for a subservient wife who exists only to serve my convenience. I want a partner who can help me expand and improve the ranch operations, someone who might take charge of certain business aspects while I handle others." "What kind of business aspects?" Eleanor asked, finding herself genuinely curious despite her reservations. "Record keeping, correspondence with suppliers and buyers, managing the household staff, possibly even helping to establish trading relationships with other ranches and settlements. I've been handling everything myself for 5 years, but the operation has grown beyond what one person can manage effectively." Lucas paused, studying her face. "I understand you have experience with financial records and administrative work." "I managed my father's mercantile business before coming to Texas," Eleanor admitted, "and I've been helping Uncle Thomas with town finances and correspondence." "Exactly the kind of skills that would be valuable in a large ranch operation." Lucas leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more animated. "Miss Hayes, I'm not asking you to sacrifice your intelligence and capabilities for the sake of domestic tranquility. I'm asking you to apply those capabilities to a larger enterprise than you've previously managed." Eleanor found herself surprised by the direction the conversation was taking. She had expected either crude demands or flowery romantic nonsense. Instead, she was being offered what sounded remarkably like a business partnership that happened to include marriage. "And the personal aspects of marriage?" she asked, her cheeks coloring slightly but her voice remaining steady. "I assume you have expectations in that regard as well." Lucas's expression grew more serious. "I believe those aspects of marriage should develop naturally between two people who respect each other. I'm not interested in forcing intimacy or demanding affection that doesn't exist. If we find that we're compatible in all ways, then our relationship can grow accordingly. If not, we'll maintain a respectful partnership that serves both our practical needs." The honesty in his voice surprised Eleanor. She had expected either crude assumptions about marital rights or awkward euphemisms. Instead, she found herself faced with a man who seemed to understand the delicate nature of the situation and was offering her time and space to adjust. "You mentioned an annulment clause," Eleanor said, referring to the contract Thomas had shown her. "Yes. After 1 year, if either of us feels the arrangement isn't working, we can dissolve the marriage with no recriminations and with your financial independence secured. I'm not interested in trapping anyone in an unhappy situation." Lucas's voice carried complete sincerity. "I believe marriage should benefit both parties, Miss Hayes. If it doesn't, then it serves no useful purpose." Eleanor looked at this surprising man who seemed to contradict every assumption she had made about him. He was offering her security, respect, and even an escape route if needed. More than that, he was offering her the chance to use her skills and intelligence in ways that her current situation never would. "I have a question for you, Mr. Blackwater," Eleanor said, her decision crystallizing even as she spoke. "What happens to the people of Clearwater Springs if this arrangement doesn't work out? If we marry and then dissolve the union after a year, do they lose their water rights?" Lucas shook his head immediately. "The water rights transfer would be permanent regardless of what happens between us personally. I wouldn't use people's survival as leverage in a personal relationship." It was exactly the answer Eleanor had hoped for, and it told her more about Lucas Blackwater's character than all his careful explanations about partnership and respect. He was offering to help her community with no strings attached, even if their marriage failed completely. "In that case, Mr. Blackwater," Eleanor said, rising from her chair with newfound resolve, "I accept your proposal." The silence that followed Eleanor's acceptance stretched for several heartbeats, during which Lucas Blackwater's expression shifted from careful politeness to something that might have been relief, though he was too controlled to let such emotions show clearly. Thomas, meanwhile, seemed to deflate slightly in his chair. as if the weight of responsibility he had been carrying had suddenly been lifted from his shoulders. "Miss Hayes," Lucas said finally, rising from his chair with the same fluid grace he had displayed since arriving, "I want you to know that I don't take your decision lightly. I understand what you're sacrificing, and I promise you that I'll do everything in my power to ensure you never regret this choice." Eleanor felt a flutter of nervous energy in her stomach as the reality of what she had just agreed to began to settle in. "When would you want the ceremony to take place?" "As soon as possible, given the urgency of your town's situation," Lucas replied, though his tone suggested he was open to discussion. "I was thinking perhaps Saturday, which would give us 5 days to make the necessary arrangements. Would that be acceptable to you?" 5 days, Eleanor repeated, the timeline feeling both impossibly short and mercifully brief. "Yes, I suppose that would work. Where would the ceremony take place?" Lucas glanced at Thomas, who had been following their exchange with the careful attention of a diplomat observing crucial negotiations. "I had assumed here in town would be most appropriate given the circumstances. Perhaps the church if Reverend Miller is available to perform the service." "I'll speak with Reverend Miller immediately," Thomas said, his voice carrying the first note of genuine optimism Eleanor had heard from him in weeks. "I'm sure he'll be honored to officiate, especially given what this means for our community." "About that," Lucas said, turning his attention back to Eleanor, "I want to be clear about the water rights arrangement. The agreement I'm prepared to sign will grant Clearwater Springs access to enough water from my ranch's supply to sustain your current population, with provisions for reasonable growth. The rights will be permanent and unconditional, regardless of any personal circumstances that might develop between us." Eleanor nodded, though she found herself studying Lucas's face as he spoke. There was something about his manner that suggested he was accustomed to conducting business with scrupulous fairness, even when he held all the advantages in a negotiation. "I have a proposal regarding the actual ceremony," Eleanor said, surprising herself with her boldness. "I'd like it to be a community celebration rather than a simple legal proceeding. These people have had very little to celebrate recently, and if my marriage is going to save their town, I think they deserve to share in whatever joy we can create from this situation." Lucas's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression suggested approval rather than concern. "That's very thoughtful of you, Miss Hayes. What did you have in mind?" "A proper wedding reception with music and dancing and as much of a feast as we can manage under the circumstances. I know our resources are limited, but people need hope and celebration to remind them why survival is worth fighting for." "I can contribute to those arrangements," Lucas offered immediately. "My ranch has ample supplies, and I could have my cook prepare food for the entire town if that would be helpful." Thomas looked between his niece and her intended husband with growing amazement. "This is far more generous than we had any right to expect, Mr. Blackwater. Please call me Lucas, we're going to be family soon." Lucas's tone was matter-of-fact, but Eleanor caught something warmer in his eyes when he looked at her. "Besides, if Eleanor is going to be my wife, her community becomes my responsibility as well. I want to start this arrangement by demonstrating my commitment to both her happiness and the welfare of Clearwater Springs." As the three of them discussed the practical details of the upcoming ceremony, Eleanor found herself observing Lucas with growing curiosity. Nothing about him matched her preconceptions of what a wealthy, reclusive rancher would be like. He was considerate without being obsequious, generous without being condescending, and intelligent without being arrogant. She began to wonder what had driven him to such isolation, and why he had chosen to end it through an arranged marriage rather than more conventional courtship. "Lucas," she said during a lull in the conversation, testing the familiarity of using his first name, "may I ask you a personal question?" "Of course." "Why this arrangement? You're clearly a man of means and education. Surely there are women in Austin or San Antonio who would be interested in marriage without the complications of business negotiations and community obligations." Lucas was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving to the window where the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the struggling town. "You're right that I could probably arrange a more conventional courtship if I chose to, but I found that conventional social expectations often obscure, rather than reveal a person's true character. This situation, unusual as it is, allows both of us to approach marriage with complete honesty about our motivations and expectations." "And your motivations are purely practical?" Eleanor asked, though her tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than offense. "Not entirely," Lucas admitted, turning back to face her. "I'll be honest with you, Eleanor. I've been alone for 5 years by choice, but I'm beginning to understand that isolation has its limitations. I need someone who can challenge me intellectually and help me build something larger than what I can accomplish alone. I also need someone who isn't impressed by my money but is impressed by my character and accomplishments." Eleanor felt herself smiling despite the serious nature of their conversation. "And you think I fit those requirements?" "I think you just agreed to marry a stranger to save your community," Lucas replied with a slight smile of his own. "That suggests both courage and the ability to see beyond immediate personal concerns to larger purposes. Those are exactly the qualities I value most." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Patterson, who appeared in the doorway looking tired but carrying what appeared to be good news. "Mayor Garrett, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought you'd want to know immediately. Martha Williams is responding well to increased water rations. Her fever has broken, and I believe she's going to make a full recovery." Thomas rose from his chair, his face showing relief that went beyond the medical news. "Doctor, I'd like you to meet Lucas Blackwater. Thanks to his generosity, we're going to have all the water we need for Martha and everyone else in town." Dr. Patterson's eyes widened as he processed this information. "Mr. Blackwater, I don't know how to thank you. We've been losing people to dehydration and related illnesses for weeks. This news will be a godsend to the entire community." "Don't thank me alone," Lucas said, gesturing toward Eleanor. "Miss Hayes is the one making the real sacrifice here. I'm simply offering water in exchange for the honor of her hand in marriage." Dr. Patterson looked between Eleanor and Lucas with growing understanding, and his expression shifted to one of deep respect. "Miss Hayes, I know this can't be an easy decision, but I want you to know that what you're doing will save lives. Martha Williams will live to see her children grow up because of your courage." After Dr. Patterson left to spread the news throughout the town, Eleanor found herself alone with Lucas while Thomas went to make arrangements with the church and begin organizing the wedding preparations. The sudden privacy felt both intimate and awkward, as if they were already married but still complete strangers. "Are you having second thoughts?" Lucas asked gently, apparently sensing her internal conflict. "No," Eleanor said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "But I'm wondering if I'm making this decision for the right reasons. Saving the town is important, but I don't want to enter into marriage as purely a martyrdom. That wouldn't be fair to either of us." Lucas moved closer, though he was careful to maintain appropriate distance. "Eleanor, may I speak frankly?" She nodded. "I think you're making this decision for exactly the right reasons. You're putting the welfare of others before your own comfort, but you're also intelligent enough to recognize that this arrangement offers you opportunities you wouldn't have otherwise. You're not just sacrificing yourself, you're choosing a different kind of life than you had planned." "And what kind of life are you offering me?" Eleanor asked, meeting his gaze directly. "A life of purpose and partnership," Lucas replied without hesitation. "A chance to help build something significant on the frontier, to use your intelligence and capabilities in ways that matter, and perhaps, if we're fortunate, a chance to discover that respect and shared goals can grow into something deeper over time." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the knot of anxiety that had been building since her uncle first broached this impossible proposition. "That's exactly what I was hoping you might say. Then we understand each other," Lucas said, extending his hand toward her. "Partners." Eleanor took his hand, feeling the strength and calluses that spoke of hard work, but also the gentleness that suggested character. "Partners," she agreed. As their hands clasped, both of them seemed to sense that they were beginning something that might prove to be far more significant than either had originally anticipated. The 5 days between Eleanor's acceptance and the wedding ceremony passed in a whirlwind of activity that transformed Clearwater Springs from a town on the brink of death to a community preparing for celebration. True to his word, Lucas had arranged for immediate water deliveries from his ranch, and the sight of wagons loaded with barrels rolling down Main Street brought tears of relief to eyes that had grown accustomed to despair. Eleanor watched from her uncle's office window as townspeople emerged from their homes to greet each water delivery with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for the arrival of long-lost relatives. Children who had been listless with dehydration suddenly found energy to play in the streets, and gardens that had been left to wither began receiving their first proper watering in months. "It's remarkable how quickly hope can transform a place," Eleanor murmured to herself, though she was aware that Lucas had arrived for their daily meeting about wedding arrangements. These meetings had become a cherished part of Eleanor's routine over the past few days. Each afternoon, Lucas would ride into town to discuss practical matters related to their upcoming marriage and the water rights transfer, but their conversations invariably expanded beyond mere logistics into discussions of books, politics, ranch management, and their respective visions for the future. Hope is a powerful force, Lucas agreed, joining her at the window. But so is effective leadership. You've organized this entire community response in less than a week. The way you've coordinated food preparation, decorations, and entertainment for tomorrow's ceremony is nothing short of remarkable. Eleanor felt herself blushing at the compliment. Over the past few days, she had indeed thrown herself into wedding preparations with an energy that surprised even her. Part of it was nervous activity, but increasingly she found herself genuinely excited about the ceremony and what it represented. "I've had excellent assistance," Eleanor replied. Mrs. Henderson decided not to leave after all once she heard about the water arrangement, and she's been invaluable in organizing the other women. And your contributions have made all the difference. Without the supplies from your ranch, we'd be having a very modest celebration indeed. Lucas had been extraordinarily generous with provisions for the wedding feast. His wagons had brought not only water but also beef, flour, sugar, coffee, and even a small barrel of whiskey for toasting. More importantly, he had sent his ranch cook, a cheerful Mexican woman named Maria Santos, to help coordinate the meal preparation. "I wanted our wedding to be memorable for the right reasons," Lucas said, his tone carrying a warmth that Eleanor had noticed growing stronger with each of their meetings. "These people have endured enough hardship. They deserve a proper celebration." Eleanor turned from the window to study Lucas's face. Over the past few days, she had begun to notice subtle changes in his demeanor when they were together. The formal politeness was still there, but underneath it she sensed something more personal, more engaged. He seemed genuinely interested in her opinions and increasingly comfortable sharing his own thoughts and experiences. "Lucas, may I ask you something that's been puzzling me?" "Of course. You've been incredibly generous with the wedding arrangements far beyond what our original agreement required. You've also spent considerable time in town this week, when I'm sure you have ranch business that needs attention. Why?" Lucas was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving to the map on the wall that showed his ranch in relation to Clearwater Springs. "Honestly, I'm finding that I genuinely enjoy your company, Eleanor. These conversations we've been having are the most stimulating intellectual exchanges I've had since coming to Texas. I'm beginning to think this arrangement might prove beneficial in ways I hadn't originally anticipated." Eleanor felt her heart skip slightly at his admission. "What do you mean?" "I mean that what started as a practical arrangement is beginning to feel like something that could develop into a genuine partnership, perhaps even friendship." Lucas turned back to face her, his expression more open than she had yet seen it. "I want you to know that I'm not just acquiring a wife tomorrow. I'm gaining someone whose company I actively seek out and whose opinions I value." Before Eleanor could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Reverend Miller, who had come to finalize the details of tomorrow's ceremony. The elderly minister was practically glowing with excitement about performing a wedding that would be remembered as the celebration that marked Clearwater Springs' salvation. "Miss Hayes, Mr. Blackwater," Reverend Miller said, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who had spent weeks delivering funeral services and was delighted to be planning a wedding instead. "I've just finished visiting every family in town, and I can tell you that tomorrow's ceremony will be the best attended event in our community's history. People are traveling from neighboring settlements just to witness this blessed union." Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of being the center of such attention, but Lucas seemed to sense her discomfort and stepped closer in a gesture of quiet support. "Reverend Miller, we're honored that so many people want to share in our celebration," Lucas said diplomatically. "Eleanor has worked very hard to ensure that everyone feels welcome at the reception." The minister beamed at both of them. "I must say, in all my years of performing weddings, I've never seen a couple approach marriage with such thoughtfulness and consideration for their community. You're setting an example of what marriage should be, a partnership that strengthens not just the individuals involved, but everyone around them." After Reverend Miller left, Eleanor and Lucas found themselves alone again, but the atmosphere had shifted subtly. The minister's words about partnership and community seemed to hang between them, highlighting the unique nature of what they were about to undertake. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Lucas asked gently. Eleanor considered the question seriously. "Yes, but not in the way I expected to be. I'm not nervous about marrying you, which surprises me. I'm nervous about living up to the expectations that this wedding seems to represent for everyone in town." "You've already exceeded those expectations," Lucas said with conviction. "Eleanor, I want you to know something before we take our vows tomorrow. This may have started as an arrangement of convenience, but it's become something I genuinely want to succeed. Not just for the town, not just for practical reasons, but because I believe we could build something meaningful together." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. though she couldn't say whether they were from relief, gratitude, or something deeper. I feel the same way, Lucas. I never expected to say that, but it's true. Lucas stepped closer, close enough that Eleanor could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. May I ask you one more question before tomorrow? Eleanor nodded. Are you willing to give this marriage a real chance? Not just as a business arrangement or a sacrifice for the community, but as a genuine attempt to build a life together. The question hung between them, loaded with possibility and promise. Eleanor realized that somewhere over the past 5 days, her feelings about this arrangement had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just agreeing to marry Lucas Blackwater to save her town. She was choosing to marry him because she believed they could create something valuable together. Yes, she said simply. I am. Lucas smiled, and for the first time since Eleanor had met him, the expression reached his eyes completely. Then I think we're going to be just fine, Mrs. Blackwater. The following morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect Texas sky that seemed designed for celebration. Eleanor woke in her uncle's house for the last time, feeling a mixture of excitement and anticipation that surprised her with its intensity. She had expected to approach her wedding day with resignation or noble sacrifice. Instead, she found herself looking forward to beginning a new chapter of her life with a man she was rapidly learning to respect and admire. The ceremony itself was everything Eleanor had hoped it would be. The small church overflowed with townspeople, neighboring ranchers and travelers who had come specifically to witness the wedding that had saved Clearwater Springs. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit, while Lucas appeared in a perfectly tailored black suit that reminded everyone of his Eastern origins, while somehow managing to look completely appropriate for the frontier setting. As they exchanged vows before God and their community, Eleanor felt a sense of rightness that she hadn't expected. When Lucas spoke his promises to cherish and protect her, his voice carried a sincerity that made those ancient words feel fresh and personal. When Eleanor promised to stand by Lucas through whatever challenges lay ahead, she meant every word with a conviction that surprised her. The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle and respectful, but Eleanor thought she detected a warmth in it that suggested deeper possibilities for their future. As they turned to face their community as husband and wife, the cheers and applause that erupted seemed to come from genuine joy rather than mere relief. The reception that followed was indeed a celebration that would be remembered in Clearwater Springs for generations. Lucas had arranged for musicians from Austin, and the combination of fiddle music, abundant food, and flowing water created an atmosphere of pure festivity that felt almost miraculous after months of desperation. As Eleanor danced with her new husband under the stars, she realized that what had begun as an impossible choice had somehow transformed into the beginning of an adventure she was genuinely excited to undertake. 3 months after their wedding, Eleanor Blackwater stood on the wraparound porch of her new home watching the sun set over the vast expanse of Blackwater Ranch. The house itself had been a revelation, far more elegant and comfortable than she had expected from a bachelor rancher's residence. Lucas had built it with an eye toward both functionality and beauty, incorporating large windows that captured the dramatic Texas landscapes and well-designed spaces that managed to feel both grand and welcoming. The transition to married life had surprised Eleanor in almost every way imaginable. Rather than the awkward coexistence she had anticipated, she and Lucas had fallen into a natural rhythm that felt as if they had been partners for years rather than months. Each morning they would share breakfast while discussing the day's ranch business, and Eleanor had gradually taken over management of the financial records, correspondence with buyers, and coordination with suppliers. Lucas had been right about her skills being valuable to the ranch operation. Eleanor's experience with her father's mercantile business had prepared her well for the complexities of running a large cattle operation, and she had thrown herself into the work with enthusiasm that surprised even her. She had implemented new record-keeping systems, negotiated better prices with feed suppliers, and established trading relationships with ranchers throughout the territory. "You're working too late again," Lucas said from behind her, his voice carrying the gentle teasing that had become characteristic of their interactions. "Maria will be offended if we miss another dinner." Eleanor turned to smile at her husband, still feeling a small thrill at the word. Lucas had changed over the past 3 months as well, becoming more relaxed and open than the carefully controlled man she had first met. The isolation that had once defined his life had given way to a partnership that clearly energized and fulfilled him. "I was just reviewing the contracts for the cattle drive to Kansas City," Eleanor replied, showing him the papers she had been studying. "I think we can negotiate better terms if we combine our herd with the Davidson Ranch." Their cattle are ready at the same time as ours, and a larger drive would give us more leverage with the railroad. Lucas moved to stand beside her, reading over the documents with the careful attention he gave to all of Eleanor's business suggestions. Over the past months, he had come to rely on her judgment completely, recognizing that her mind for commerce complemented his understanding of ranching in ways that made their operation more successful than either could have achieved alone. "This is excellent work," Lucas said, his admiration evident in his voice. "You've identified exactly the kind of efficiency that I've been trying to achieve for years. How did you know to approach Davidson about this?" "I've been building relationships with the other ranch wives during my visits to town," Eleanor explained. "Mrs. Davidson mentioned their timeline, and it occurred to me that cooperation might benefit everyone involved." Lucas shook his head in amazement. 3 months ago, I was managing this entire operation by myself and feeling constantly overwhelmed. Now, thanks to your contributions, we're running more efficiently than ever and actually expanding our market reach." Eleanor felt the familiar warmth that came from Lucas's recognition of her abilities. He had never once suggested that her role should be limited to traditional domestic duties, instead encouraging her to apply her intelligence and skills wherever they would be most valuable. "Speaking of expansion," Eleanor said, her voice carrying excitement about a new idea she had been developing, "I've been thinking about diversifying our operations. What would you think about adding sheep to our livestock?" Lucas raised an eyebrow, his expression suggesting both surprise and interest. "Sheep? That's unusual for this part of Texas." "Exactly why it might be profitable," Eleanor replied, pulling out additional papers she had been researching. "There's growing demand for wool in the eastern markets, and sheep require less water than cattle, while being more efficient grazers. We could use the marginal land on the northern section of the ranch that's not ideal for cattle." Lucas studied her research with growing excitement. "Eleanor, this is brilliant. The profit margins on wool are significantly higher than beef, and you're right about the water efficiency. Have you identified potential suppliers for the initial flock?" "I've been corresponding with ranchers in New Mexico who specialize in sheep breeding," Eleanor said, producing letters from her research file. "They could provide us with high-quality breeding stock and initial training for our hands." As they discussed the details of Eleanor's sheep ranching proposal, Lucas found himself marveling once again at the transformation his life had undergone since their marriage. What had begun as a practical arrangement had evolved into a partnership that exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Eleanor wasn't just helping him manage the ranch. She was helping him envision possibilities he never would have considered on his own. "There's something else I want to discuss with you," Lucas said as they moved inside for dinner. "Something personal, rather than business-related." Eleanor looked up at him with the attentive expression that always made him feel completely heard and understood. "What is it?" "I've been thinking about our marriage contract," Lucas said, settling into his chair at their dining table. "Specifically, the annulment clause." Eleanor felt her heart skip, though she wasn't sure whether from anxiety or anticipation. "What about it?" "I'd like to void that provision," Lucas said, his voice carrying a seriousness that made Eleanor give him her complete attention. "Not because I want to trap you, but because I want to make a new commitment. One based on what we've discovered about each other rather than what we assumed when we began this arrangement." Eleanor set down her fork, recognizing that they were approaching a conversation that would define the future of their relationship. "What kind of commitment?" Lucas reached across the table and took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "Eleanor, what we've built together over these past 3 months has exceeded every hope I had when I proposed this arrangement. You've not only become an invaluable partner in the ranch, you've become someone I actively choose to spend my life with. I'm not asking you to stay married to me out of obligation or gratitude. I'm asking you to stay married to me because you want to build a future together." Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes as she processed the weight of what Lucas was saying. "Are you telling me that you've fallen in love with me?" "I'm telling you that I love the woman you are, the partnership we've created, and the future I can envision with you," Lucas replied without hesitation. "I love your intelligence, your courage, your kindness to the people of Clearwater Springs, and the way you've thrown yourself into building something meaningful here with me. I love the conversations we have every morning over coffee and the way you challenge me to think differently about everything from business to life in general." Eleanor felt her heart swelling with emotions she had never expected to feel in an arranged marriage. "Lucas, I have to tell you something. I didn't expect this either, but I've fallen in love with you too. Not with the security you provide or the life you've given me, but with the man you are. I love your integrity, your generosity, the way you treat your employees with respect, and the way you've encouraged me to use my abilities without ever making me feel like I need to choose between being a wife and being an intelligent, capable woman." Lucas brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. "Then we're in agreement. This marriage isn't just a successful business arrangement. It's become the foundation for a life we're both excited to live." "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice strong and sure. "I want to void the annulment clause too. I want to commit to this marriage not because I have to, but because I choose to." Lucas rose from his chair and moved around the table to embrace his wife, holding her close as they both acknowledged the transformation of their relationship from arrangement to genuine love match. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said, her voice slightly muffled against Lucas's shoulder. "I've been thinking about children." Lucas pulled back to look at her face, his expression showing surprise and delight. "Children? I think we would be good parents," Eleanor said, her cheeks coloring slightly but her voice confident. "We work well together. We've proven we can build something meaningful, and I think children would benefit from growing up in a household where both parents are fully engaged in creating a successful life." Lucas's smile was brilliant. "Eleanor Blackwater, you continue to amaze me. Yes, I would love to have children with you. I can't think of anything that would make this partnership more complete." As they held each other in the dining room of their ranch house, both Eleanor and Lucas reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as a desperate deal between a failing town and a wealthy rancher had transformed into a love story that neither had anticipated, but both had helped create through their mutual respect, shared goals, and growing affection. Outside their windows, the vast expanse of Blackwater Ranch stretched toward the horizon, representing not just land and cattle and financial success, but the foundation for a family and a future built on genuine partnership and love. Clearwater Springs continued to thrive with its reliable water supply, its people secure in the knowledge that their salvation had come not just from a business transaction, but from a marriage that had blossomed into something beautiful and lasting. In years to come, when people told the story of how Clearwater Springs was saved and how Lucas Blackwater found love, they would speak of it as proof that sometimes the most desperate circumstances can lead to the most unexpected blessings. Eleanor and Lucas had entered into their arrangement believing they were making practical sacrifices, but they had discovered instead that they were creating exactly the life both had always wanted, with exactly the partner each needed. Their love story would become legendary throughout the territory, inspiring other arranged marriages and giving hope to communities facing their own desperate circumstances. But for Eleanor and Lucas themselves, the greatest joy lay not in the legend they had created, but in the daily reality of a partnership that had exceeded every dream and expectation they had brought to their unusual beginning. To end,